Okay, great. All right, so let's get into some housekeeping. So as you've seen, we will be recording this call and sending it around afterwards to registrants. So even if you're not with us live, welcome. I'll also be sure to send the PowerPoint around. We have a lot of people on the call today, and it's a call format, not a webinar format. So we just ask that you stay muted during the presentation. Thank you so much in advance for that. You are definitely welcome to put questions in the chat throughout, or there will be some time at the end for Q&A. Ambitiously, we made this call 30 minutes, but we added some content, but we're going to do our best to stay at the 30 minutes. No worries if you have to drop off. Like I said, it'll be recorded, and happy to answer any questions that we don't get to via email or in a follow-up after. All right, there's some folks in the waiting room. I'm just going to let them in. Great, great. Welcome to everyone who's just joining us. So nice to see you all. Okay, so here's what we're going to go over today. We're going to start with a little bit about what's happening in Congress right now. And especially, we're really just going to go over what's happened since the Skills Summit, since that might be the last time you all checked up on Congress and the administration. We have a new WIOA, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act reauthorization drafts. We have some updates on appropriations and funding. There's been a little bit of movement on short-term Pell, and then we'll also briefly address apprenticeships because we got some questions about that in the registration form. And then we will conclude with a little forecasting about what's next for Congress and the presidency. And so with that, we're going to start with what's happening in Congress, and I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Megan Evans, who is also Senior Government Affairs Manager at National Skills Coalition.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So what's happening in Congress right now? Well, both the House and the Senate finished their August recess and returned 2 weeks ago. They're about to head out again after next week for another recess for campaigning and work in their districts. The challenge that this creates is that there are some things that need to get done by the end of this month, and there are things that need to get done by the end of this Congress. So they have 1 week to get work done on appropriations, or at least a continuing resolution that will keep the government open. That is needed by the end of this month, so 12 days, including today. Even if they do a continuing resolution, that wouldn't necessarily give us through the entire year funding for the fiscal year, which begins at the October 1st. So like I said, 12 days to deal with the government funding or face a shutdown. It seems like right now we're going to get something in place because it doesn't seem like both parties believe that it would help them with their reelection prospects if we shut the government down right now. Just yesterday, the House voted on a fiscal year 2025 continuing resolution that would have run for about 6 months, and it also included legislation that would require new voting restrictions around voter registration. That bill was basically doomed from the start. Senate said they wouldn't take it up. And it failed with 14 Republicans voting against the legislation, although it is notable that 3 Democrats from some of the most vulnerable districts in the country voted in favor of that legislation. And those Democrats were Golden from Maine, Davis of North Carolina, and Gluesenkamp-Perez from Washington. The other piece of legislation that Congress prides itself in getting done every year is the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. While it's not directly related to workforce, so we won't go into a lot of detail, they still need to pass that bill, which provides authorizations and authorities for the activities for the Department of Defense. Occasionally, in the amendment process, a workforce amendment might get attached to that piece of legislation. So we're waiting to see what comes out of discussions that are ongoing right now. Senate leadership is currently preparing a package that could be filed as soon as this week. But as I mentioned, there's not a lot of time to finish a bill before the end of this month when they go on their recess for campaign work, and certainly not or as well by the end of the year, because, you know, if you look at the calendar, I think I measured it out, and I think there's only 6 congressional weeks left for the entire year. So not a lot of time unless they, take away some of their campaign weeks or they stay in past what they intended in December. Let's move on to some specific workforce development specific policies and priorities that we're seeing right now. And I mentioned appropriations. Right now they're talking about a continuing resolution, but they still need to get the full year bill done. And so just want to start off by showing you all sort of an illustration of funding for some of the key workforce programs over the years. So in 2001, which was a high watermark for funding for workforce programs, you can see in this chart that in some cases we were spending more money in 2001 dollars than we are currently in 2024 dollars. If you go to the next page, Caroline, thank you, you'll see if we adjust that for inflation, we should be spending a lot more. The red line for all of you is the inflation adjusted. I know some of the labels are a little small on this. So you have yellow is 2001, the middle, which is red, is inflation adjusted of 2001 and what we would be spending if we kept pace with inflation. And blue is 2024. So as you can see, we're not spending enough. And the bad news is that trend is essentially continuing for what's been proposed for fiscal year 2025 numbers. The House numbers are much worse than the Senate. In general, the Senate keeps funding relatively level with this current year, which, as you know, with inflation, that's really a cut. The House makes some pretty damaging cuts to programs across the board. Caroline, would you mind moving to the next slide? This chart shows a lot of the workforce programs that we pay attention to versus last year. So FY24 is what was enacted for this current funding year that we're underneath. The House proposed fiscal year 25 column is what was proposed in the House. The Senate proposed is the Senate's bill. And then you see the difference, which compares the Senate to the House. So those two red numbers you see there are the only places in the Senate is investing less than the House. Everywhere else, it is level or they are investing significantly more. Next slide, please. Some of those highlights are that the House bill entirely eliminates WIOA youth and senior community service employment program funding. So it zeroes those out completely. That is not the case in the Senate bill. The Senate bill actually increases funding for apprenticeship $140 million over the House bill, though only $5 million over current year funding. I know we also had some questions about reentry employment opportunities. That is level compared with the current funding year in the Senate bill, but it is $55 million lower in the House, so they make some cuts there. And then the Pell grant stays level in the House bill, but is increased by a modest sum of $100 in the Senate bill. As you know from NSC's work, we are out there with your help advocating against cuts and for more funding. We had a organizational level letter that we sent up in August with about 150 signatures from organizations. And then we also had a business focus letter that we just recently sent up last week with over 120 signatures from businesses. So we are working with all of you to try and avoid major cuts and boost funding, but we are in a sort of a difficult situation. You might recall that there was a debt ceiling agreement about a year and a half ago that limited funding levels. The Senate has tried to go above those and the House has seen those as a ceiling. And so they're cut below. And so we're at a little bit of an impasse. As I mentioned, they're currently working on a CR. One just failed yesterday. I do think that there will be a CR put in place that will likely take us until after the election, so about 2 to 3 months. And then they will have to come back and decide if they're doing another CR or if they're going to pass full funding for the rest of the fiscal year. With that, I will pass it back over to Caroline to talk about where WIOA is.
Yeah. Thanks, Megan. If you're just joining us, just want to reiterate, thank you for joining, and we are recording. So if you missed the first 10 minutes, you'll be able to watch it back. So moving on from appropriations to maybe one of the biggest policy changes, policy movement that has happened since the summit, the skills summit, which was in May, is the Senate released a draft of Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act reauthorization. Um, that draft has not moved to the committee floor nor the full floor for a vote. It's unclear if it will be brought to the floor before the end of this Congress. There's been a tough negotiating point between businesses and labor organizations about if businesses who have certain violations from the past couple of years can be eligible participants in WIOA funding. And so that has kept the bill in negotiations since July. There are still some bipartisan conversations ongoing about how to move the bill forward in the Senate. We think that, if it does get picked back up, it's likely to be after the election on the Senate side. But it's going to be tough because of that tension I mentioned earlier, as well as just kind of racing against the calendar. However, it is a huge bipartisan win to even have moved this far. And it's because of our network's advocacy, because of raising it up as an issue for Congress relentlessly over the past year. And like Megan said, we are not tiring as advocates. We're going to keep moving forward. Some of you all might have seen we've set up a WIOA advisory committee. So we'll have that in the next Congress. That's a variety of stakeholders who work within the WIOA system every day, who will be guiding our federal policy recs and advocacy going forward. And ultimately, looking at it kind of in a glass half full light, even if the bill doesn't move forward this Congress, this just gives us an opportunity to work on an even better bill for next Congress. So I don't want to get into too much detail about the Senate discussion draft because Megan and I worked on 3 very, very detailed blogs that analyzed WIOA Senate discussion draft. So if you want any more details, those are a great place to start to read at your leisure. But there were a few things that we wanted to highlight for you all. As mentioned, getting Congress to move on anything in this divided partisan climate is a huge win, and it really speaks to our advocacy that we've done as a network, that we've enabled Congress to think about workforce development. There are also some key definition updates that move things in the right direction, that remove some outdated language. For example, updating ex-offender to justice-involved individual. So that's great to see. If you were at our summit, you'll remember that some of our main asks were around increasing funding, integrating industry partnerships, as well as career services. So that's what the 3 blogs are about. Just to dive a little bit deeper into it, funding levels for the Senate discussion draft are funded at such sums, which is typical legislative language that it doesn't take a strong stance. It really just kicks the can down the road to the appropriations committee to set the amounts. So of course we are advocating for increased investment in our WIOA system. Industry partnerships, we see greater integration in the Senate draft. Industry partnerships can apply for incumbent worker training funds. They can apply to be on the employer training provider list. So any integration is great, but of course there's more that can be done really to kind of seize on the convening power of industry partnerships for businesses and workers. The Senate also does propose funding for some industry partnerships in what's called the Industry Sector Partnership Development Fund, which is exciting, but the funding for that would take money away from local areas. So we don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul, as they say. We want to make sure the system is funded so that these industry partnerships can stand up without diverting other money. And then finally, digital skills. Getting workers digital skills, we know, is an important issue for a lot of you. The discussion draft definitely updates definitions and integrates digital skills throughout to reflect our ever advancing technological world. But as you'll remember from the summit, we want to create a funding stream that enables workers to get digital skill training specifically. So we'll continue to advocate for that in the future. Just a couple more here that we wanted to go over. The One Door Act. So in the Senate, there is a pilot program proposed that would allow consolidated state allocations for states that hit a certain population mark or have a certain amount of local areas or below. So this would essentially eliminate local workforce areas to create a single statewide area. While this kind of centralization works for some states, we know that it can risk inequitable spending in others. And it can particularly impact rural areas or areas with high populations of barriers to employment. We also know it can discourage some of our small and mid-sized businesses who often engage in the system at a local level. It can discourage them from engaging with the workforce system. There was also some proposed changes to the employer training provider list. It adds automatic eligibility for community colleges and labor organizations. It also increases the eligibility requirements for being on the ETPL. And so while, again, it's important that we are ensuring that these are quality training providers that lead to a quality career, some of the criteria and the data that they are hoping to collect to be on the ETPL is either not currently collected or set at a threshold that might be difficult for even quality training programs to apply for or to be a part of. So this can discourage providers with strong programs from participating in WIOA. And then finally, there are some proposed changes to individual training accounts. The Senate discussion draft expands on the House proposal version by creating supplemental ITAs for a broader range of individuals, including adults, dislocated workers, and youth. However, it limits spending to $5,000 for training costs alone, so it does not include those crucial wraparound supports like childcare, transportation, et cetera, that we know are crucial to folks finishing their training programs. Like the House bill, to fund these newer ITAs, it would pull from existing funding sources. And as many of you have pointed out to me, ITAs are already eligible to be used for adults and dislocated workers. So it's a bit of a redundant proposal. So again, that's a high-level overview of WIOA, and feel free to check out the 3 blogs for more details. And now I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer Stittard, who's a senior fellow on the government affairs team, and she's going to give us an update on short-term Pell.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you all, and welcome to the webinar for those who are participating. So I want to cover some updates on short-term Pell as well as apprenticeship. And these are probably going to be a little less detailed as some of our prior things that we're covering today, but we want to talk about the state of this legislation. So for those who aren't aware of what short-term Pell is, essentially when you think about the Pell Grant program, it operates as an entitlement and provides financial aid for students in post-secondary programs. One issue with it is you have to be in a program that is 600 clock hours or at least 16 weeks and above. So what short-term Pell is trying to lower that threshold for clock hours for weeks to try and include more workforce-oriented programs and specifically more quality workforce-oriented programs. So in years past, we've talked a lot about the Jobs Act, which is sort of the granddaddy of short-term Pell proposals. But we've shifted a little bit to talking about it as short-term Pell as a whole, because throughout the years, we've seen more and more of these proposals come out. And I'm going to drop a blog in the chat right now. So if you're interested in learning more about the different bills that are out there and the nuances of those bills, we're not going to go over them right now because that would take too much time and just be a lot. But if you are interested, we have a blog that sort of covers the differences of those. So where are we at right now with this? NSC has been doing this for a number of years, and we have seen movement on it, but we haven't seen passage quite yet. So this year overall, we've seen more momentum, I would say, in the House of Representatives than we've seen in the Senate. There's been a lot of bipartisan agreement between the House Education and Workforce Chair, Virginia Fox, as well as the ranking member, Bobby Scott. Over on the Senate side, it's been a bit more challenging. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of stop and start, but we haven't yet seen their version of the bill or a commitment to sort of mark up legislation and try and move it forward to a floor process or negotiations with the House. So where does that leave us for the remainder of the year? And that's kind of a bit of an unknown. NSC continues to operate a coalition of national groups that advocate for short-term Pell. Recently, we sent up a letter to both the House and the Senate that had over 200 signatures. Many of you and your organization signed on it as well. But as Megan and Caroline mentioned, the days are kind of fleeting this year, right? If something's going to happen, it's probably going to start to happen next week. So we will know very soon about the prospects of the legislation for the remainder of the year. We still think it's possible. I would say conversations are ongoing. They continue to look for areas of agreement, but we have hangups in it, right? A big part of it is they want to make sure programs are quality, and defining what is quality is not something that has a universal view. So we have issues around, should they bar online only programs? Should for-profits be excluded? These are things that there's difficulty in finding consensus on in order to move the bill forward. So right now it's possible. We continue to advocate. We suggest you continue to advocate, because even if it isn't a 2024 issue, it will come up again in 2025. With that, Caroline, would you go ahead and move on to apprenticeship? So to touch on apprenticeship just quickly, we have a couple of different items on that. First, I'm going to talk about congressional action, which is actually the second bullet point on here. For probably about, 4 years now, we've been talking about doing a reauthorization of the National Apprenticeship Act. And what that means is every so many years, Congress looks at legislation and decides, okay, we're going to update it, we're going to modernize it, we're going to put in reforms that we would like to see. National Apprenticeship Act is a little bit unique. I don't think it's been updated since the 1930s, and it largely exists just in regulation. So this has been a big task to try and move it forward. Much like short-term Pell, the House has seen more ability to find compromise than the Senate. I don't think we're going to see an apprenticeship bill in 2024, but I have to imagine it's going to come up again in 2025. So in lieu of an apprenticeship bill, the Department of Labor at the end of last year decided to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking. So this is particularly significant for apprenticeship because so much of it exists within regulation. Even though this is something that happened, 9 months ago, it's still relevant to what's going on right now. It was about an 800-page proposed regulatory change. And for NSC, we had about 2 months to go through and make comments, which we did. And we talked with a number of our network members in developing those comments. So sort of at a high level, I would say, things that were good about the proposed apprenticeship rule. It had better data elements and sort of a better way to use those data to improve the system. Overall, it centers equity in a way that we haven't previously seen. And I would say it's created stronger alignment across states overall. Concerns, and there were a lot of them, quite frankly. And I don't think I saw any organization that submitted comments that didn't have concerns. Overall, it makes the system more complicated. It's a complicated system to begin with. Businesses aren't mandated to participate, so we want to make sure we have good participation with good apprenticeships overall. Other things, we didn't love what it did with pre-apprenticeship. We felt that that could be strengthened, that could be better integrated. And it also eliminated what's known as the competency-based model, which is something the Department of Labor spent years developing. So we support that. We were kind of surprised it was eliminated, and our comments noted that to that end. So what happens now? So late 2023 was the proposed regulations. The final rule, we think it could still come out in the fall. We've been hearing rumors that it'll be right before elections. We've been hearing rumors that it is right after elections. And who knows, maybe it won't come out at all, but we're hearing it's still happening. It's still going to occur. When that does happen, NSC will do a full analysis, probably a blog, and we will send out information to our network. All right. With that, I think I'm passing it back to Megan to talk a little bit about energy.
Yes. So this isn't exactly, I know we promised you a congressional update, but we dove into regulations a little bit. This is not related to Congress, but the Department of Energy's 21st Century Energy Workforce Advisory Board, which is shortened to EWAB, released last week a report outlining what the department should do over the next few years. NSC's board chair, Gerard Melanson, serves on that committee, which has been a big help to us because we were able to not only get some of our data that we commissioned included, or rather cited in that report, but it does also reflect some key NSC priorities as well in the components of that report. Some of those include using and collecting data to record DOE's workforce activities and those around equity and quality in energy jobs, prioritizing careers rather than training for specific tasks, incentivizing employer commitments to direct hire, retention, career pathway strategies, and supporting industry or sector partnerships. There's a lot more in there, and I don't want to go too far in depth, but I am going to drop the link to the report in the chat so that if this is of interest to you, you can check it out, because I do think it flew under the radar a little bit. The next piece I wanted to go over, and I'm going to try and be quick because I know we're already running out of time, is I want to talk about looking forward. So crystal balling a little bit. We talked a little bit of what's going on now, what they need to get done. But the election is going to play a pretty big factor in what happens next year. And even to some extent for the remainder of this Congress once they return from their election recess. So we know for sure that there is going to be a new chair or ranking member, Republican leader in the House for the Ed and Workforce Committee. Dr. Fox is stepping down from her role, even though she's running for re-election. And the two likely leads of that committee on the Republican side are either going to be Burgess from Utah or Wahlberg from Michigan. Obviously, we have pretty strong networks across the country, in Michigan in particular. Utah is a little less strong. So that is one area where we're going to be focusing on developing our network, not just in case he is the chair ranking member, but so that we are making sure that we are strong across states in this country. There's also a potential for change Senate side as well. While Senator Cassidy is running for re-election and is likely to be re-elected, he may choose a different committee to serve on, which in likelihood could mean a Senator Rand Paul chairman or ranking member on that committee, which obviously has implications for what bills that they're considering, what those bills look like, and also collaboration across the aisle. I also added a photo of Senator Braun, who is running for governor in Indiana. So we will lose a key workforce advocate on the Republican side of the aisle, who has worked with us on several pieces of legislation. And the other piece of that with elections, we already know that next Congress, 56 House members will not be returning either because they're running for higher office. They lost their primaries, they're retiring, which is about 15% of the current House. With the election, people could lose in the general election, and so that number could be much higher. In the Senate, at least 10 or 10% are going to be new members of that chamber. Some may come up from the House, so they might not be new members of Congress, but they will be new to that chamber. And so that's going to mean a lot of opportunity to engage with new folks and start right after the election, helping folks understand what our issues are as skills advocates. It also presents a little bit of a challenge, right? Because we are losing some of our key co-sponsors on pieces of legislation. We're losing folks who we've created strong relationships with over the years. And so we will be also having to develop new relationships with folks as well. And so that is where we're going to be focusing a lot of attention. And I encourage you all to do the same with your advocacy efforts. And we are happy to serve as a resource for those efforts as well. With that, I will turn it back over to Caroline.
Yeah, I'm just going to wrap us up here. Thanks for staying on. I know we're a couple minutes over. So just kind of looking forward, continuing to look forward. Of course, in addition to the congressional election change, there's the presidency. Maybe you guys have heard of this election that's coming up. So National Skills Coalition is working on transition plans for a Harris administration or a Trump administration, and we will send those documents up to the presidency once the election wraps up, hopefully in November. Other things that we're working on, we have conducted listening sessions this summer with our worker and student voice network. So hearing from workers and students themselves about how the system is working. We are distilling those into themes, and we are planning to share those with Congress. And then we'll continue to monitor appropriations. We'll continue to monitor if anything happens with short-term Pell in these next couple of weeks. So definitely stay tuned and stay in contact with us. And then post-election, we'll continue to monitor the education and workforce makeup, as well as the help committee on the Senate side. We'll likely do another call like this at the beginning of next year, if not sooner. So we'll do a deep dive into the new committees, any new members of Congress, as well as probably the presidency as well. And just kind of to conclude here, I know that we all have been advocating all year for workforce development. I think we've made a lot of progress. I hope that you all can see the progress that's been made in Congress. It's never too early to start thinking about next year. Of course, we always have our annual summit in May, where you're welcome to join us here in DC. If you're interested in taking any sort of leadership role around the advocacy in that, it's never too early to get in contact with Megan and I about that. And otherwise, thank you all for joining. And I think we can move to Q&A. You're definitely welcome to come off mute or submit in the chat. I think we might have one in the chat already. Yes, we do. Okay, so we got a question. Is the National Skills Coalition doing anything to guide Commerce or other agencies on their investments in workforce? Yes, definitely. I think we have several technical assistance projects going on. One is through our infrastructure campaign. So I know we're guiding several states on how they implement their infrastructure dollars. I know we're also doing similar work in our digital equity at work campaign, kind of guiding investments in digital skills as well. Megan or Jennifer, anything you want to add there about how we're going?
Yeah, I mean, we continue to have ongoing conversations with staff at the national level as well. If you were at the summit, you will have seen that the secretary herself joined us from Commerce. So we have great relationships there, and we are in regular communication about what we would like to see. They often consult us on our opinions, and love to dive in with our advocates as well, because they see us as a crucial constituent and stakeholder to consult. So the answer is yes. We have ongoing conversations and are working to direct their efforts.
Any other questions, or if anyone would just like to share anything they're working on with the group, you're also welcome to. Okay, so I see we got one about Pell grants. Jennifer, maybe I'll toss it to you. I'll just read it out loud. Would the expansion of Pell grants only cover tuition, or could it also support non-tuition costs of enrolling in training?
So obviously we don't have a final bill yet, but if it works like a regular Pell Grant, which we anticipate it would, it covers what's called cost of attendance. So when you calculate cost of attendance, that includes both your tuition and fees, your course materials, your room and board, and other living expenses that they calculate, such as transportation, um, childcare. So I think in many cases, what would happen is you would look at, what is the cost of a full-time student, and you would sort of prorate it back based on the clock hours or the weeks of the program. But I think would have to find out once it passed in regulation how that would exactly work. But yes, it should.
Awesome. I'll do one more call for questions or anything else folks would like to share. And other than that, okay, great. Just making sure. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day.